When the United States temporarily allowed Russian oil tankers stranded at sea to deliver their cargo to India in March 2026, it raised a question far larger than a routine sanctions waiver. Who actually determines the limits of a major power's energy policy? According to shipping estimates, millions of barrels of Russian crude were floating offshore under sanctions pressure, waiting for buyers. Then Washington issued a short-term license permitting those cargoes to reach Indian refineries. The decision instantly ignited political backlash inside India and strategic debate across global energy markets. This video examines how that situation emerged, why it matters for geopolitics, and what it may reveal about power, leverage, and policy miscalculations in one of the world's fastest-growing energy economies. If this arrangement expands, collapses, or triggers broader sanctions pressure, the consequences extend far beyond a single shipment of crude. India imports roughly 85% of the oil it consumes, making supply security central to its economic stability. Russia, meanwhile, has redirected enormous volumes of crude toward Asia since Western sanctions intensified after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The United States sits in the middle, attempting to punish Moscow while preventing a global supply shock that could push prices dramatically higher. When Washington temporarily authorizes oil already loaded on tankers to reach India, it exposes the fragile balance between sanctions enforcement, energy demand, and geopolitical bargaining across three major powers. The roots of this situation stretch back several years. After Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the United States, the European Union, and the Group of Seven imposed sweeping restrictions on Russian energy exports. These measures aimed to reduce the revenue Moscow could use to finance the war. Yet global oil demand remained high, and removing Russian supply entirely risked pushing prices above levels already strained by pandemic recovery and inflation. India saw an opportunity. Before 2022, Russian crude represented less than 2% of India's imports. By 2023, that share had surged above 30% as discounted cargoes flowed eastward toward Indian refiners. Those purchases reshaped trade routes across Eurasia. Russian producers such as Lukoil and Rosneft relied increasingly on a complex logistics network involving older tankers, opaque ownership structures, and ship-to-ship transfers designed to keep exports moving despite financial restrictions. Western regulators repeatedly tightened enforcement, targeting insurance, banking channels, and shipping firms linked to sanctioned cargo. By late 2025, pressure escalated further when the United States sanctioned additional Russian oil majors in response to the continuing war in Ukraine. Large importers suddenly faced higher compliance risks. Cargoes that had already been loaded onto vessels found themselves stranded offshore as traders searched for legal pathways to complete deliveries. That is the context behind the March 2026 license issued by the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control. The authorization allowed crude of Russian origin that had already been loaded onto tankers by March 5th to be delivered and sold to India until April 3rd. American officials framed the move as a narrow technical measure designed to prevent disruptions in the global oil market. Their argument was that allowing already shipped barrels to reach buyers would stabilize supply without significantly boosting Russian state revenue. In effect, Washington attempted to balance two priorities simultaneously: maintaining sanctions pressure while preventing a sudden removal of millions of barrels from circulation. Inside India, the announcement triggered intense political criticism. Leaders from the Indian National Congress argued that the episode suggested an uncomfortable reality. The timing and legality of India's purchases were effectively shaped by decisions made in Washington. Opposition figures contended that a country describing itself as strategically autonomous should not appear to require foreign authorization to import energy. They also highlighted that New Delhi had previously signaled it might reduce Russian oil purchases as part of a broader trade understanding with the United States. The contradiction between those signals and the new waiver fed accusations that policy coordination had been poorly managed. Some analysts extend that criticism further, suggesting administrative missteps by the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi contributed to the dilemma. India had benefited for years from discounted Russian crude, but the regulatory environment around sanctions was tightening rapidly. Critics argue that New Delhi underestimated how quickly enforcement mechanisms could change and failed to establish clearer contingency strategies with alternative suppliers. When shipments became trapped under sanctions uncertainty, India's refiners were left waiting for a decision from the same country imposing those restrictions. In this interpretation, the waiver did not simply solve a logistical problem. It exposed weaknesses in policy planning. Consider the first possible future scenario. If sanctions enforcement intensifies again and similar waivers are not issued, Indian refiners could face abrupt disruptions to a supply stream that has at times accounted for more than a third of their imported crude. Replacing those barrels quickly would require turning to Middle Eastern producers or the United States, potentially at higher prices. Even a modest increase of $10 per barrel would translate into billions of additional import costs annually for India's economy. Manufacturing and consumer prices across a country of more than 1.4 billion people. A second scenario moves in the opposite direction. If geopolitical tensions in the Middle East escalate further, especially following the recent US and Israeli military actions involving Iran, global oil supply could tighten dramatically. In that environment, Washington might tolerate continued flows of discounted Russian crude to major consumers such as India to keep markets balanced. Such a development would reinforce India's role as a key refining hub, processing Russian oil for domestic use and export. Yet it would also deepen the paradox at the center of this episode. A rising power seeking strategic autonomy while operating inside financial and regulatory structures dominated by another. The broader lesson emerging from this moment is less about a single waiver and more about how energy, finance, and geopolitics intersect. Oil tankers drifting offshore in 2026 illustrate how sanctions regimes can shape global trade routes as decisively as military force. They also reveal how quickly domestic political narratives collide with the realities of interconnected markets. Whether the situation reflects miscalculation, diplomatic compromise, or pragmatic crisis management remains debated. What is clear is that energy security now sits at the crossroads of great power rivalry